So we've just heard this story, a story which to me always gets me wondering, maybe ever since I first heard it as a child, how can this be possible? How can this be true? How can a person be raised from the dead like this and
Frozen.
so today I want to play with one possibility, one interpretation. What we're doing today is resurrecting Jesus right here and right now, and I want to play with that today. Because we're here and we're along with maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world, both in this moment and then throughout history, we're really collectively willing for the growth of that God part that we feel within us and that life of Jesus. We're willing for that to be raised. We're willing for that to be lifted up. And I want to go back to my childhood. I first met Jesus in the pew. I was a young boy in Catholic church. And, just in these short little snippets of stories that I'd hear week after week. And he was almost like, for me, almost like an action hero of human virtue and compassion and moral imagination. Just see him in these scenes of the gospel, he just kind of flicker out with all this courage and, unexpected, surprising compassion. And he'd be challenging the powerful and being like, you hypocrites. And then also, reaching out, bringing in the sick, bringing in the stigmatized, welcoming them. And he was speaking about this world that, the world that should be, even though it isn't, but the world that can be, if we believe, then it can be. And that sense of that just boldness has always inspired me. So I'm always just kind of moved with this sense of agency and possibility. And I feel, when I'm hearing these stories, I just feel drawn in to this movement, this great movement, like I belong, like I'm part of this movement for peace and justice. And I'm also connected, I'm in with this mysterious force of life that connects us. It's this, you could call God, it's greater, it's beyond ourselves, and yet it's integrally a part of who we are. I also think of this as our highest self, and when I see these stories of Jesus, I feel more connected to that. I feel more alive with that. And I want to go even further back into history, 2,000 years ago, in the Roman-occupied territories of Israel. We're in a setting of profound poverty, violent oppression, inequality, meaningless suffering. This is where Jesus lived. And this was a world in which the Roman emperor was declared to be God. You had to acknowledge that the emperor was God. And in that world, Jesus was a very stark alternative reality. What if a common person, a poor peasant, the child of a teenage mother, was actually the locus of God's activity? Very different alternative. What if God did not uphold the power structure of the empire at all, but was with the common people struggling against it? And that was what Jesus embodied when he was preaching this God of possibility, this God who ruled over a world that didn't yet exist except in the hearts and minds of the people who really were hungering for justice, were thirsting for righteousness, were seeking that world. Jesus said, that's God. That's the God that's real. Not of this world, but of a new world that's possible. And so this belief in the resurrection of Jesus is very powerful. It's audacious. It's kind of in your face with just a shocking claim. But it's such a powerful belief that I think the belief itself has made the metaphor real. I would say over the past 2,000 years, Jesus has risen. He has indeed risen. The morality he taught of each person being sacred has indeed risen. And the possible world that he just boldly proclaimed, even though it did not exist, except in a few small actions and in a little community that he was part of, that world's still growing. Peace, justice, and equality, that kind of vision, that's really growing from potentiality to actuality over the past 2,000 years. So in a manner of fact, he has risen because he's still alive in all of our minds, and he's still inspiring so many people to create this new way of life. And I think in the past year in this country, I see kind of a corollary, a reminder, or kind of kind of possibility of how the power of belief, the power of affirming and believing in the sacredness of life, of lifting up a life. I look at the case of George Floyd, who was killed by the state. There's a real comparison with Jesus, who was also killed. His life was taken away, treated as meaningless. And yet people are, bringing that kind of energy of saying his life mattered, along with many other black people who have, been killed by the police. And so when I hear, for example, Black Lives Matter, to me it has a ring in it, and it sounds a little bit like Jesus is risen. That may not first compute, but when you first were saying Jesus is risen 2,000 years ago, you could get killed for that, because it was really a subversion. It was a bold subversion of the state authorities who killed Jesus and the religious authorities who wanted him dead. To say Jesus is risen just kind of flipped that on its head, just like that energy of Black Lives Matter really flipping the power structure on its head and saying what the society says doesn't matter, does matter. God is there. And that was kind of the original spirit of the Jesus movement. They had another phrase, Jesus is Lord, which was a very common, very important slogan. It was the direct opposite of the state propaganda. Caesar is Lord. The Roman Empire is God. Emperor is God. You have the early Christians saying, Jesus is Lord. This other world is the real world. It doesn't exist yet, but it's happening. It's going to happen. It's sad, and I'll just have to mention this, but it is sad that throughout the history of Christianity, the original meaning, for example, Jesus is risen, Jesus is Lord, it really doesn't work if Christianity is being oppressive. If it's aligned with the empire, if it's dominating, if it's destroying other forms of worship and so forth, it doesn't work. It does not have that life-giving power at that point. So it doesn't mix well with power over others, even though it has done that and is still doing that in many settings and is really out of key with the true meaning of what this is about. What I feel it is, if I had to kind of like put it in a nutshell, there's a kind of resurrection lifestyle that could be possible. That would be all about honoring and lifting up the highest part of ourselves, which might be called the Buddha nature or original nature or Christ consciousness. It's this part of ourselves that carries a profound hope for humanity. And the resurrection kind of faith is that God will not let that die. And even if it seems to die, even if it's been crushed or covered with a stone, that God will remove that obstacle and God will raise the best of humanity from the dead. It's an audacious hope. And it's evident that this is a power in the world. I see it all over the place. Yes, I see it in George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I also think another great example that many of you will know well, Hippolyte, who's been such an amazing part of our community. I see him as really living this lifestyle of resurrection. He survived the horrors of the Rwandan genocide and was caught in this type of cycle of violence and oppression that really was trying to pull him in. He had to really muster this inner strength and connect with this, that highest self within himself to break free of that cycle and to find within himself peace and to find within himself the energy to work for reconciliation in his society and in our greater world. That reemergence of that love within him, that true self, to just show up in the world after all he went through, to me, that's a resurrection right there in real time. It's just that our highest nature is just supported. It is supported to rise through hate and violence. It's supported to just break through and make this world what it really should be. And so, with all that, I want to leave us as a community with some questions to ponder. They're not just rhetorical questions. I think they're real questions for our community. One big one is, how can we make the resurrection real in our own lives and in our community? How can we make this metaphor real in what we do together? In what ways can we elevate that part of ourselves that lights up when we hear the stories of Jesus and other great peacemakers and avatars of compassion? And I just want to say, it doesn't have to be Jesus perfectly or exclusively representing this part of ourselves, but there's many symbols out there. There's many people who bring this to life. In what ways can we cultivate a sense of possibility and vision that is unhindered by the dominant patterns of the way things are? How do we let our true light within not be blocked, not be limited, but really have an audacious scope of hope? How can we build up the courage needed to see and to tell and to embody how our world must change and grow? In what ways can we as a community take on that hope, that defiant hope that first said Jesus is risen, and that keeps saying we will not give up, and that always returns to hoping that the best of human nature can and will rule the day? That's what I feel our community is really about. And when we're at our best, we're pretty much got that energy of resurrection in what we do. We're just edgy on hope. We're just edgy on peacemaking, or we're edgy on trying to save the environment. We're just engaging in a difficult conversation about, racism, or bringing people together that no one thinks can come together. When we're kind of on the edge of hope, when it's more kind of beyond what we can do, but we're counting on that force to just propel us, then I feel like we're right where we should be. We're right in that place of hope and opening up to letting some greater power that's also our highest potential to just shine and to rise. So that is a possibility for what this whole story of Jesus' resurrection could mean. It could be our community right here, right now, and in what we do, making that true. Making it true by living it out.